Welcome and welcome, we take it in English, to this new AreaS seminar. This seminar is a presentation of our new book coming later in 24. Our first book in 2019 was about borders. Our second book in 22 was about alliances. And this book is about digital trust. So today, we present the first chapter, one of the chapters of the books. I'm going to read the list of the contributions, but we're very happy to have the visit of Kai Heidemann, associate member of AreaS from the University of Maastricht, to present his chapter. And I will say some words about our new book, and Sondre Lindahl will give feedback of the chapter, and hopefully there will be some questions in the public to ask after Kai's presentation. Just to give you an idea of the book, the working title of the book, which is maybe the final title, is Trust and the Threat, Challenges in a Digital Society. We have 11 contributions. I read for you the names and the title. Laila Berg wrote about political trust in Scotland, 2014 independence referendum and digital political participation. Hadal Boygebin wrote, together with Sondre, the chapter Trust and Democracy in a Digital Society. Vladimir Chavez wrote Trust and Betrayal in the Virtual and the Real World, an approach to Nefando 2016. Kirsti Cole and Joanna Wagner wrote Crisis Pregnancy Centers, Digital Rhetoric, Misinformation and Trust. Samba Dyalimpa Badji wrote Trust in Information Sources in Time of Conflict, How New Media in Ethiopia and Mali build their credibility amid information disorder. Håvard Friis Nielsen wrote a chapter, The Importance of Trust in Classic Republicanism, Lessons for a Digital Age. Kai Heidemann wrote the chapter Social Movements in the Grassroots of Political Trust, Building Solidarities in an Age of Social Distrust. Anja Müller-Gjesdal, Øyvind Gjerstad and Céline Poudard wrote the chapter Trust in and Distrust in Expert Knowledge, the Case of Climate Change on Wikipedia. I, Frank Urban, wrote the chapter Sowing the Seeds of Distrust, Foreign Cyber Interference in 2017 and 2022 French presidential election. Elin Strand-Larsen wrote the chapter Truth, the First Casualty, Fake News and Fact-Checking in the Israel-Palestine Conflict. And Mari Sturden-Yareid wrote the chapter Framing Distrust, TikTok as a Discursive Arena for Rivalry between the US and China. So what is the heart of the book is the relationship between digitalization and trust, and how the digital age is impacting trust and the concept of trust. So, welcome, and now I leave the floor to Kai for your presentation and to Sondre for comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is that working out okay? Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing me here. It's nice to be here in Norway, coming up from Maastricht in the Netherlands. And thanks to Frank and Ellen and everybody involved with the AreaS project for giving me a little bit of a moment to chat about some of the stuff I'm interested in. I got this really interesting project where I was asked to contribute on the relationship between trust and the digital society, which is a theme we're all spending a lot of time thinking about and talking about these days. So I don't want to, talk about too many things that we're already overly familiar with. So I'm not a scholar of digitization or of media, actually. I'm a scholar of a social movement, so I'm a political sociologist. And I study social movements in the broad sense, looking at the ways in which movements seek to influence different types of institutions. Mostly education is my main focus. Looking at the ways in which movement actors try to usher in school reforms and changes to educational policy. That's actually what my main research is about. I've done that work in France and Spain and Argentina, the US. I'm currently involved in a project in Belgium. But it was a real pleasure to get this invitation to write about something that I think a lot about, but I hadn't actually spent a lot of time researching, which was the impact of the digital age on social movements. And I really liked that I was asked to make a focus on trust as one of the themes in there, because the more I thought about it, the more I thought of the importance of mistrust and distrust, especially in social movements. So thinking of the place of trust in social movements, trust is a really essential, I guess what you could call a resource in social movements. On the one hand, it's an emotion. On the one hand, it's a set of meanings and narratives. On the one hand, it's ways of thinking, navigating the world. Trust plays a big part in keeping people together, bringing people together in social movements, but keeping them working together in social change projects that often don't have a very a clear outcome from the onset. A lot of people engage in social movements not really knowing if, let alone when, they may realize their goals. So trust is a big part of how it works. It works internally in social movements, the ways in which people interact with one another in sustained ways and develop trusting relationships and bonds. That's really essential to part of the fuel that keeps movements going and growing, so to speak. But there's another way in which trust works, and that has to do with the world outside of movements and the ways in which people in movements, activists, movement leaders, constituents, in movement campaigns and organizations, the ways in which they assess and interpret the world around them in terms of trustworthiness. So other actors in the world, political parties, for example, are evaluated in terms of being more or less trustworthy. Other activist groups are evaluated in ways of being more or less trustworthy. And of course, then there's the realm of institutional trust and the ways in which people in movements assess an institution as being more or less trustworthy. And the negative forms of trust are really important in terms of driving movement. So I talked a second ago about the positive ways in which trust works to keep people together, but there's what you could call negative trust, which is the forms of mistrust and distrust. Mistrust basically being, when we're not sure we can trust somebody, the idea that we don't have enough evidence of whether I can trust somebody, right? I don't know you well enough to trust you, so I mistrust you. But distrust is a little bit different. That means I have the evidence that I can't trust you. And distrust can be a big part of what keeps movements going. So thinking, for example, of the way in which activist groups evaluate media outlets as being more or less trustworthy, or the way in which they assess media sources being distrustful. We don't trust that source. Or a political party, we don't trust that party. And that distrust is a big part of what mobilizes people in movements. So in thinking of this theme of trust and in relation to the digital age, which is what my task was, so to speak, my homework, I was thinking of this question, well, how is it that the rise of the digital society that we know is now just fairly ubiquitous, at least in some parts of the world? It was something that we really take for granted. In other parts of the world, there's still quite a big digital divide in the world today. But in a lot of places, such as Northern Europe, the digital society is, it's all around us, right? It's something that we really take for granted. So I was thinking, what are the ways in which this has impacted social movements, and particularly in the ways in which they mobilize trust and mistrust and distrust and stuff like that. And looking at kind of a big picture of it, of how digitization has impacted social movements, more specifically the creation of digital information communication technologies, but I'll just say digital media to keep it shorter. And I was talking with Frank earlier about this, and he had a nice metaphor of it, because it's a nice French way of looking at it, that it was sort of an evolving love story, this relationship between social movements and digital media, that what started off as a story of techno-euphoria, we may call it, where there was this idea that digital media were really going to be this emancipatory tool, a really empowering new development that was going to usher in a new era for social movements. And when I'm talking about social movements in the moment, I'm referring more to what we might call progressive, justice-oriented type movements. For the moment, I'll bracket the discussion of more reactionary, radical right movements and things like that, or counter movements. So I hope maybe have a chance to talk about that in a minute. But for the moment, I'm just talking about what we might call progressive, justice-oriented movements. So the moment of techno-euphoria came because there was this idea that, well, now we're no longer dependent on corporate media to tell our story, because what movements need to keep going and growing in many ways is visibility and legitimacy and the things that that media can give them. So for a long time there was this idea of the movement's dependence on mass media systems, right? Mass media, commercially oriented media, large newspapers and news agencies, or in some cases state-owned news agencies, were basically the gatekeepers, right? And so for movements to get visibility for their claims, for their actions, they had to get recognized in the public sphere, have the cameras show on them and tell their story, seeking out visibility in order to gain voice, and movements were really dependent on media outlets for that. But in the early days of the internet, there was a lot of euphoria in terms of thinking, oh, well, that relationship no longer exists. Our dependence on mainstream media is now been broken, because we have this more democratic kind of public sphere now, where all we need is internet connectivity, and there we go. We can broadcast our voice ourselves. And that certainly was a big part of the story for a lot of activists. The infamous Zapatista rebellion in the 90s, which was seen sometimes as one of the first internet movements, as it were. One of its big successes was being able to generate visibility on a transnational global scale by basically hooking into to internet streams and gaining visibility through independent media and things like that. And then, of course, later on in the 2000s, the Arab Spring, that was seen as some people called it the Twitter revolution. All these moments were seen as examples of this bold new age that was being ushered in by digitization. But if you fast forward a little bit and get more into our contemporary moment, we see that the techno-euphoria has really died down in many ways, and gone into more of a, well, I guess what you could call a techno-skepticism in the world of activists and progressive movements. And the reasons for that are perhaps better left to media scholars to talk about, but a big part of that is because of the way in which the internet has changed. That it's no longer the internet of freely navigating, right? If you remember back in the early days of the internet, that was the metaphor, navigating the net, right? Like you could get on there, all you needed was the internet connection, and you could get out there and navigate, and it was a sort of equalizing sort of force. But today you have a much different landscape, which is what some people call the platformization of the internet, which is a sort of a capture of this internet into privately owned commercial platforms that really dictate the ways in which we experience the net. And then we have almost a reproduction of the very thing we thought we were getting rid of 25, 30 years ago, right? Which was corporate owned commercial media really dominating the way that we experience the internet. So movements find themselves again in a situation where, in order to get the visibility and recognition, it's not just a question of being able to stream and to create your own sort of media site to get the message out there, but you're still depending on your message becoming viral, right? And so people who are looking into the impact of digitization on social movements are looking at the way in which it's really changed the way in which a lot of progressive movements work. There's a Turkish scholar, Zeynep Tufekci, who works in the United States. She's written quite a bit about this, and she has some perspectives that I find really useful. And she basically says that movements today have become really, particularly youth-led movements, have become very dependent on digital media as the primary tool for organizing. So that movements have become really good at mobilizing, but as she says, they've become crap at organizing. Because one of the main questions that has fueled Zeynep Tufekci's work is this question of, well, why do progressive movements keep losing? It's sort of maybe a depressing story, but when you look politically around in a lot of places, it certainly looks that way. And so she's wondering, we have all these mobilizations, all these protests, all this alternative media that's circulating around, but in the end, the movements aren't able to be impacting the institutions. They're not able to seize political power. And one of the arguments that she makes, and others have made, is that's because the movements are really dependent on seeking visibility through online venues and spheres. That movements today, a lot of progressive actors are much less concerned about building organizational structures that can endure over time. So while we can mobilize and protest, which is a very important part of what movements do, there's still the question remains of, well, what happens the day after the protest is over? Where are the structures, the organizations that will allow the movements to sort of persist over time? So those are some of the big questions that social movement scholars are looking at today, and some of the things I talk about in the book chapter, just giving a bit of an overview of some of the stuff that interests me in this chapter. Some of the things I show in the chapter are different examples of what we call radical alternative media and the ways in which radical alternative media play an important role in building important forms of trust and distrust in social movement communities. Some important forms of radical alternative media, what they allow the public to do is provide a more trustworthy source, so to speak, for the movement community. But again, there's the question of if these alternative media, and there are many out there, are sometimes feel like a bit of a voice in the wilderness. That we still rely on the large platforms to provide the visibility, the forms of visibility that movements need to achieve that scope, to be able to mobilize on a large scale, and to be able to mobilize at a large scale persistently and consistently, as opposed to the sort of momentary waves. So these are some of the things that I'm interested in, and maybe we can start up a conversation here, and we'll take it from here.
All right, I'll try and unmute myself, which seems to work. It's actually funny when you mention the digitalization and the ubiquitous rise of the internet and how to navigate it. When you had the all now discontinued browser Netscape Navigator, which I think worked for Macintosh, and with that euphoria or that optimistic view, and I think we see some of that also in the AI development now. Do you have people who are, AI is going to dominate everything, this is how AI works? Then you have other people saying, well, it's perhaps a bit more nuanced, and I see some similarities there. But I wonder if we could just go back a little bit, because it's easy to start just with the digital society. But let's start with just a bit more, I think, about social movements and trust. It's like, why? It's like, if you can just speak in general, how does actually trust work for social movements? How do they build and maintain it? Because they actually have to start there, and have started there, traditionally, and then the way I see it, here comes the digitalization and starts to change it. But could you just say something more about social movements and trust in general?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I sort of had mentioned a little bit before, I mean, it has what we might see the internal and external dimensions of trust building and trust work in social movements, and then there's the positive and negative forms of trust, right? So when we talk about the internal dimensions of trust, that has to do with the relationships that people build in activist communities or in organizations in which they see each other as trustworthy. We have a mutual recognition of each other, that we can depend on each other to some extent to work together in a common project. I mean, and here I'm talking about people who are organizers, people that are dedicating quite a bit of time to social movement work, the labor that's needed to keep movement agendas going. This is not, like liking a page on Facebook or something like that. This is actually what you call the sort of, activism, right? And in order to build that trust, people need to be engaged in some kind of sustained interaction, right? You need to get to know people. You need to spend time with them. And historically in movements, that was what a lot of people were doing in the work of organizing meetings to decide what was to be done, creating flyers and leaflets and going door to door. The sort of struggle of activism and the uphill sort of battle was how people build trust, right? You could think of the role of bookshops in the feminist movement, for example, right? There's a lot of nice articles about that. Nancy Whittier has talked about that in the United States, the role that just getting around to talk about the work of feminist thinkers and philosophers and writers was a way in which feminist activists began to develop trust. Similar things with the civil rights movement. The role of the church in the United States was really important for black civil rights activists as a place to build trusting relationships, right? So you need some kind of a space. There's a strong spatial dimension to trust building in social movements, because you have to have these sustained social interactions where people can develop the forms of confidence in each other and a mutual recognition and respect, which is an emotional thing, but it's also very much about meaning making and then this kind of narratives and discourses that people have about what they're up to and why these issues they're engaged in are important, right? So that's very much the internal aspect of trust building in social movements. But as I mentioned before too, there's a strong external part where people in movements are evaluating the world around them in terms of who are potential allies that we can count on, the ways in which they identify certain politicians or political parties, for example, as being potential allies, or the ways in which black civil rights activists would form allies with white progressive activists in the United States, for example. That process took time to form those interracial bonds and relationships based on trust in the black civil rights movement. And the same with feminist movements and the role of men in feminist movements. And that's also about building trusting relationships with actors or groups that are outside the movement. And those are all examples of the positive form of trust, right? As trust is the presence of trust, that sort of confidence or faith in a way that we have in each other. But that negative part of trust, the distrust and mistrust, is also happening at the same time there. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have those. I mean, you talk about those. There's an interesting thing here about those progressive justice movements, if you can say, and at least some movements that I know, especially on the left, also tends to eat up each other. There's something that happens. I'm not sure if you looked into that, but there's also something that happens. See that in the U.S. with the weather movement, weather underground movement, or the democratic student unions, etc., which is kind of a social movement, but they tend to eat up each other, which is something interesting. I think that's also that negative side of it, but that's a different discussion when we talk about the negative side. Yeah. Because then we go on to the online, because myself and a colleague, we also contributed to this book, and we looked at some old forms of trust building. Say just the example of going to the bank and you meet people. So you do the service, or you go to the bank, but then you talk with people, and so you have the distance is closed between people, so you can talk. And Frank, obviously the head of AreaS, very wealthy man, and then here comes the ordinary scholar, and it's like we talk and we do the same services and we're in the same environment, and so we can sort of build trust between each other. But then when everything becomes digitalized, or more and more, where are those meeting spaces, right? Question, and how does that actually, so from your point of view, social movements, you want to create change. I mean, the point, as Marx told us, the point isn't to interpret the world, but to change it. And so how do you do that if you have fewer meeting places, and the meeting places you have are online, where you actually don't know. I mean, we just met physically.
Yeah.
You know, now we met each other on Zoom. So you know, difficult kind of to build trust maybe on Zoom, but
Yeah, well, I think you're pointing at a really big question, which people are trying to answer, right? And I certainly don't have the final answer to that question, but we do definitely see that online spaces are capable of generating trusting relationships, actually. You know, we tend to think of the online sphere as being really good at creating large networks of what we call weak ties, right? In social network theory, there's like strong ties and weak ties, right? And we tend to see the online world, well, it's really good at building lots of weak ties, like networks based on weak ties. And that's certainly true, but there's some interesting research that also shows the ways in which online spaces can very much foster the creation of strong ties, particularly within established networks. Right, so when you have, for example, an activist collective or an activist group, and they use online spaces, technology, to further maintain their interactions. So it's people who, yes, they do meet in person periodically, but they use the digital tools to really maintain a more constant, really sustained interaction, and that's a good evidence of how these digital tools work to reinforce trusting relationships for people, because also these online spaces where they can engage in I mean, even just a WhatsApp group, as simple as that sounds, allows people to keep maintaining conversation as a group, right? As opposed to the telephone call, or you don't always have to meet with people face to face. So there is evidence that that forms trusting relationships, right? And you can also find in the online forum, web forums and things like that, ways in which the dynamics of mistrust can happen, right? Sort of comment threads or different types of forums. You really see this in far-right groups really well, because the anonymity of these sort of spaces really allows for people to say things that they may not be too comfortable with saying when their name and their picture is shown, right? But these sorts of spaces allow people to form bonds based on mistrust or distrust of others. And that's an important way in which people form solidarities. We agree on a common sort of injustice. We agree on a common wrongdoing in the society. That there's that distrust we have of certain agents in society is what bonds us together, right? And some people say that negative trust will never be enough to allow movements to persist. I mean, these are questions that scholars ask. You need that positive trust to really keep movements growing. Some people might argue that the negative form of distrust, mistrust, won't be enough. But you can see the online spaces, you know, as well being capable of these trust building dynamics, right? But I think. You know, the question's not out. I mean, I don't think we have an answer of, you know, being techno-euphoric or techno-skeptic. I mean, I guess I prefer what we might call techno-nominalist approach, right? Let's take it on a case-by-case basis, right? There are times where, yeah, the technology is empowering for movements and does really great things. We have examples of that. And there are other moments where it's not, where it's actually disempowering and creating a lot of obstacles and challenges for movements. So yeah, but you know, it's more the perspective I would take.
Yeah, no, I like the element of distrust. I mean, the stuff that I'm researching means that I do spend some time on forums like 4chan, where you actually see, you know, how distrust is the uniting factor. You know, it's like you don't trust, you know, whatever establishment or, you know, institution or groups, and that sort of bonds people together enough that some people use that to support terrorist actions, like Brandon Tarrant or Manshaus here in Norway. And we also saw another threat now against the parliament here in Norway on 4chan. Not sure about how serious that really was, but you see that form sort of the sites like 4chan seems to sort of in some ways build some kind of trust, or something that actually means that people want to put their ideas out there and some people actually carry it out. So that seems to be supporting them somewhat. But any questions? I have more questions, but I'm not going to monopolize the discussion. If anyone has If anyone have questions, I see Frank is gearing up for a question.
Yeah, just a question. Progressive social movements keep losing. Radical rights movements or groups keep winning. Why are these radical rights movements more successful in using the digital tools than maybe people on the right side or the radical left side? What would be the? Is it a technological aspect that we don't see, don't understand, or is it the way of using it based on mistrust, as you said? You know, what would be your interpretation?
Boy, that's a big question, right? I mean, one of the perspectives is that movements of the radical right are winning the online sphere because of the sources of support that they have from the networks that they draw support from. So there are some scholars who would argue that radical right movements tend to be more successful because they are less threatening than radical leftist movements, right? So anti-feminist, anti-environmentalist, these sorts of movements that defend white privilege and things like that, they are less threatening to a status quo, some would argue, right? And that they are more likely to gain the support of elites, right? So if you think of the Koch brothers and Koch Industries and these sort of big think tanks in the United States, who create a lot of spaces and who create events and sponsor things for a lot of right-wing libertarian type initiatives in the United States. If you go back to the Obama era and the whole Tea Party movement thing, I mean, there was a whole discussion in social movement studies about the idea of astroturf movements, right? So we talk about grassroots movements and you talk about astroturf movements. And the basic distinction is an astroturf movement is something that's sort of made to look like a grassroots movement, but it's kind of a fake grassroots movement. When you do a little homework and you look behind the phenomenon, you find actually that there are elites and potentially other sets of authorities who are creating something that looks like a social movement. Not to say that there aren't real people, like it's not that everybody's an actor there, but it's something that has been kind of staged by elites and then which then attracts people. I mean, there's a long tradition of this in Latin America where political parties, opposition political parties, you know, create protest events that are made to look like it's a bunch of people that organized this and took to the streets, but it was actually a political party that orchestrated it, right? So that's kind of maybe a windy way to answer your question. But the idea that radical right movements are more effective because they tap into networks that are much more resource rich. There are also some people on the more Marxist colleagues would say that they don't threaten capital, right? So that's part of the reasons why they're more effective. Yeah.
I also have to just add there because I have experiences with some, if we can call them progressive justice or really far right left wing social movements in a way. And this is only just a personal anecdote, but a lot of time is spent on what I would call non-issues or related to the main issue. So they will spend, in meetings, and I've observed it, a day discussing gender, right? The issue is something else, but they argue a lot about other issues. When I go to 4chan or I experience right-wing movements, they seem to be much more to the point. So they spend all their energy on this issue, whereas the others, and but I see other movements on the left side maybe they spend more time on surrounding things, topics, and not so much energy on the issue that at hand. And I think maybe some of these because distrust is easier to mobilize around, maybe like you have this perceived notion that immigrants are taking over your country. That's a rallying cause. It's much more easier to sort of, if you feel that strongly, then you can sort of focus on that. But if you want to change something, and you talk about emancipatory issues, which is a hugely problematic term, of course, and what is that, and what does it entail for people? It's a difficult discussion.
Yeah.
Whereas those immigrants have to go out, that's a much easier case to sort of rally around. So I wonder if that's what you think about that. Just maybe it's just easier to build trust when there's maybe hate involved as well.
Yeah. Well, hate and negative emotions. James Jasper, who's a scholar of emotions and social movements, he's talked about this. That the negative emotions of like hate and fear, these sorts of things really do a good job of mobilizing people in the short term. They can really galvanize people in the short term. But when you look at in terms of the capacity to keep people committed and working together over time, those negative emotions will only go so far, right? I tend to say that the positive emotions of like hope, which is of course a very loaded utopic sort of word, but these sentiments that are linked to hope and some notion of an alternative future being possible is what will allow people to keep working together, right? But let's also think of one of the reasons that movements that stress negative emotions such as fear and hate, which are of course emotions that movements of the radical right tend to traffic a lot in, misogynistic type movements and racist movements. So this is their bread and butter, right? Let's not forget also part of what happens with digitization is some people call the algorithmic opportunity structures that movements face. What the big platforms prioritize is sensationalism and spectacle. And this is what the movements of the right might be really good at saying, very provocative, controversial, vitriolic things that everybody looks at, whether you agree with it or whether you disagree with it. We're all looking at it and paying attention to it because it's crazy. And it seems like the more crazy your message can sound, the more visibility you get. So, it reminds me a lot of the these parliamentary sessions of the UK Parliament, where you have, I don't know if you ever watch these on television, but sometimes they can be a lot of fun to watch. But one of the things you see is that the loudest voice in the room is not always the most well informed. I get that in my classroom sometimes too. I find like the students who chat the most are not the ones who have done most reading. But so there's something going on there, right, with this sort of algorithms and because let's not forget that the public sphere, the online public sphere, the platformization of our public sphere, as some people, as critical media scholars have talked about it, it's a commercially driven process. If you have things like Meta and X that are mediating our public discussions, I mean, their motives are making money. Pure and simple. It's not about necessarily having reasoned, deliberative debates to improve our democracy, right? And this sort of goes, I think, to the stuff that you're interested in your chapter.
Yeah. Just you mentioned crazy, you mentioned making money, so I'll mention Trump.
You went there. I didn't go there.
Well, no, and I'll own it. Because he has his own social network platform, Truth, I think it's called. I'm not sure how well that is working, but what I'm interested in, and it may be outside your interest or whatever, but I was listening to the radio on the way here, and they talked about Trump and the MAGA movement. So people are talking about the MAGA movement, which they're talking about it as a social movement. And we have a social movement scholar. So therefore, I want to ask you just about why do people in this, let's call it the MAGA movement, trust Trump? Do they trust Trump? But why? Because it seems so counterintuitive to me. That they would, but are they? And if that's the case, why?
Yeah, boy, you really went there, didn't you? Yeah. I was hoping we could avoid the T word, but here we are. Yeah. Again, I certainly don't have the magic answers to that, but I think part of the trust in Trump stems from the perceived distrust in other sectors of society, right? The distrust in big government. I mean, we've seen a very strong right-wing libertarian movement in the United States emerge. particularly since the big financial crisis in the 2000s during the Obama era, the Tea Party movement and that sort of stuff. The origins of Trumpism are partially to be found there, and a big part of what right-wing libertarianism is about a distrust of the state, period. I mean, you have left-wing libertarianism, which has also a distrust of the state, but it works in slightly different ways. But there's no left-wing libertarianism really in the United States, not much anyway. So yeah, I think that the trust in Trump stems from the distrust of the Democrats and the woke community and all that sort of stuff that people are fearful of. Right. So again, the negative emotions of fear, dislike, distrust are a powerful part of what catapults the Trumpist sort of movement there. But I mean, Trump taps into things also that have been around in the United States for a long time. You know, the trinity of right-wing movements in the United States is the white nationalist, nativist movements, as they used to be called. The idea that the United States should be a white country, and this sort of anti-immigration rhetoric that's been there for a very, very long time. That's not a new phenomenon. Also, the Protestant evangelical movement, which has interesting intersections with a sort of Christian nationalist movement, the idea that the United States should be a Christian nation. You could see that with the recent Supreme Court justices there, right? And also the libertarian movement, sort of pro-business, sort of hyper-capitalistic kind of aspect of it. So these three sectors of the far right have different social movement histories, different movements that have been of the right that trace way back in U.S. history, and Trump is, I think, is the latest incarnation, really, of these three things coming together. I mean, his support from the evangelical community is really, it's quite amazing, but it's a purely transactional relationship. I don't think there's too many evangelicals who really think trust is a true Bible thumper, right? But well, yeah.
Well, that's exactly the point, right? Where whether it's transactional, or whether they actually trust him, or they actually are able to identify.
They trust
Trump.
him to give them power.
Yeah, exactly, and well, that is what I've been thinking, anyways. Yep. But it's interesting because you're willing to give somebody a tremendous amount of power that obviously, you know, given his lived life, do not espouse the same values as you have, but you're still able to, he's still able to transcend it, which is fascinating. You know, but yeah, Frank.
Just a last question before we leave the floor to the public for questions. But in the last part of the chapter, you coming back to the progressive left movements, and you talk about RAM, and I mean it's almost like going offline again, you know, going back to the 60s or the 70s, you know, to build up a new kind of social movements, progressive social movements. Could you give us an explanation of what are those RAM trials, you know, and some examples?
Sure, yeah, there's RAM, which is just an acronym for what some people call radical alternative media, right, or activist media, social movement media, and of course there's a long tradition of that. Movements have always sought to create their own sort of media, right? I mean, the role of the printing press for the labor movement, you know, that was important. Broadcast radio, the civil rights movement. There was a WERD in Atlanta was a famous civil rights radio station. You know, the role of broadcast television. Think of the anti-war movement and student mobilizations of the '68 generation, right? Each sort of moment of media development also became a potential tool for movements to try and use as well, right? Underground newspapers were a big part of movement cultures, and so with the development of digital information communication technologies, obviously movements will seek to maintain those alternative media cultures, and so there's tons of examples out there. Some of them that have a lot of followers, and some that have very few followers. I mean, the ecosystem of radical alternative media out there is vast, and I think we don't know enough about it, particularly in terms of its impactfulness. So I think people who study these things tend to look at the content of these sources, to look at what they're saying, and less taking a bigger sort of macro view of how these media, alternative media ecosystems, what their impacts actually are. I think that'd be some really important research that we need going forward. Yeah. And there's all kinds of great examples out there. I mean, some of them are really just websites that publish on a very local level, so they don't have a big reach or impact. But what they're doing is filling in spaces that have been vacated by local news, because in many parts of the world, local newspapers and local journalism has just died, and so people call news deserts. Right, so communities where there is no news reporting, places in rural France or some cities in the United States and post-industrial places, there's no local newspaper anymore, and so what you have is sort of activist media that now plays that role. So filling in these gaps that are important, and other times you have this sort of alternative media that can be pretty big, like Democracy Now! In the United States, which is sort of almost like a news media channel, but that relies on progressive, justice-oriented news. And it puts the camera in the hands of activists. It puts activists in the camera. It lets activists and movement actors tell their story, which is generally not what happens on commercial and corporate-owned media, right? And you find that people are talking about movements, but rarely are movements given the opportunity, or movement actors given the opportunity to speak for themselves. I mean, you think of much of the coverage you see of protests, it's images of protests and protesters, and then you're being told a story of what's been happening, and maybe if you're lucky, they'll put the microphone in what could be the craziest looking person they could find on the street and ask them to tell you a story of what they're doing there, right? So alternative media, movement media, it's the news in a sense brought to you from below, as some people say. And of course the quality and the resources that these media outlets have varies enormously. Sometimes they have no budget, sometimes they have pretty decent budgets. The Young Turks, which is a progressive news show, started as a radio broadcast in Los Angeles, and it's turned into a YouTube phenomenon. And it has a very sort of progressively oriented approach. Now, I don't think it's really activist media in the sense that the people involved in that show don't really seem to be coming from the activist community, but the things they talk about, the way they talk about things, have a lot of relevance for movement networks. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Elin?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Kai. This has been really, really interesting listening to you now. I have two questions, actually. The first one might be a stupid question. Sorry for that.
No such thing.
You talk about right-wing and left-wing social movements. Will all kinds of social movements place themselves on sort of a political spectrum? And why do we always hear so much about those extreme right-wing or extreme left-wing social movements? So that was the first question. And the second question is more like question of, I would like to hear what you think about it. Because just the other day I saw a documentary from how the media in Norway had covered oppositional voices during COVID-19 and those being critical about wearing masks, what is the content of COVID-19 vaccines, shutting down schools and kindergartens and so on, and how the expense of being in opposition to an opinion where you also have both the states but also the media very much supporting whatever the government, the decisions of the government, and also being in sort of a crisis, you know, the costs and you know, you had doctors losing their licenses, you had people that, yeah, just lost all of their friends and sort of most of their families and also jobs, you know, because of their opinion and those daring to voice critical opinions about, you know, the efforts of, you know, yeah, going against, you know, the official opinion of the community during a crisis. So, yeah, that was my 2 questions.
Yeah, well, COVID is, of course, a great example of what you're trying to get at, right? I mean, for in social movement studies, COVID, the COVID protests and anti-vax protests and all the things that were happening there were a really interesting moment in social movement research, particularly in terms of trying to make sense of what was going on, right? And so one of the things in social movement studies, and when I teach my course on social movements at Maastricht University, you know, one of the first things I always start with my students on is, well, what is a movement? Right? What is a social movement? Because a protest is not a social movement, right? But we know protests have something to do with social movements, right? They're social movement moments, right? And by studying protests, we can learn a lot about social movement stuff. And the COVID protest was really interesting in so many ways. On the one hand, in terms of media narratives, trying to make sense of it. A lot of what happens in media coverage of movements is a homogenization of movements, which are usually very complex, dynamic, heterogeneous phenomenon, right? But there's a desire oftentimes in newsrooms to make this movement into like a unitary actor. But sociologically speaking, we know that that's not what movements are. They're networks of many different types of people and organizations that do have something that they all share, but that there's tons of factionalism and diversity in there. And the COVID protests were so interesting for that, because when you looked at it, it was really a hodgepodge of people. Sometimes it was left wing, right wing, chicken wing, whatever. It was just all kinds of people out there protesting things, sometimes for slightly different reasons. But I mean, I think people who have looked at it did say that their one common theme, at least in the United States, was that it did tap into this libertarian kind of thing, at least in the United States. I'm not sure how that was up here in Norway or in other parts of Northern Europe. I'm not sure how strong the libertarian movement is up here these days, but in the US, that was definitely a big part of it. But don't forget also that a big part of the BLM waves that came out, the Black Lives Matter, happened during COVID as well, right? But that wasn't a explicitly COVID protest, but the COVID pandemic really brought a lot of racial inequalities to light in those communities. So yeah, that was definitely an interesting moment. And then in terms of, you know, labeling movements as left wing or right wing, I mean, there's one thing in terms of people in movements having labels for themselves, and another thing is when you study movements to try to make sense of them and place labels on movements, right? It's what in social science we call the emic and edic distinction, right? When you try to define a phenomenon, the emic distinction is you use the categories that people use for themselves, the sort of subjectivist orientation. But the edic approach is to look at different phenomenon and to come up sort of with an externalized definition of it, which is sometimes helpful. So I know that when we categorize things as left wing or right wing, very often in social movements are progressive versus regressive or reactionary or something like that. It has to do with the nature of change that the movement is seeking to promote or resist. Because movements are about both. Usually they seek to promote some type of transformation, but at the same time they're usually trying to resist other kinds of changes, right? You can think of feminism for an example. It's trying to do both. It's often trying to protect certain gains that have been made, while at the same time always moving forward to gain new grounds, right? So a lot of what differences in left-wing and right-wing classifications have to do with the logic of citizenship that the movements mobilize, being inclusive versus exclusive. And that's to me, one of the most useful criteria for defining right-wing versus left-wing movements is that right-wing movements have exclusive models of citizenship. Well, they have a very narrow model of who belongs and what citizenship and then the civil domain consists of. Whereas those leftist movements that are always arguing about gender and what equality means and who's being left out and who's being triggered by what debate, which is as frustrating as that politics of authenticity can be, which is a big part of the factionalism that leftist movements find themselves in. It tends to be precisely because of the type of political project they're involved in, which is about inclusivity and things like that, and thus they tend to fall down the trap of the authenticity of politics, as opposed to creating the alliances and coalitions that they may need simply to acquire power, which is what the right does really well. It's more of a focus on getting power, right, or keeping power.
I think we're going to stop the recording for the last Q&As, and thank you, Kai.
Thanks for having me. Yeah,
to visit us in Norway, and our book. Elin, Sondra, and I are editing this book, and this book is coming after summer, hopefully in September, October, and we look forward publishing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.